In this video, I'm going to show you how to create your very first environment with Unreal Engine. This tutorial is geared towards complete beginners who have never even downloaded the engine before. Everything I show you will be applicable whether you want to make a video game or short films, and I'm going to go click by click so that you can work along with me as I show you how to set up a project, import models, construct a scene, set up lighting, and render a short animation. All you need to follow along is a copy of Unreal Engine, which is totally free, and you'll also need some 3D models. I'm going to use a mix of models from ProductionCrate and from Megascans, but you can use whatever models you want. You'll still be able to follow along just fine. So first things first, let's install Unreal Engine. You'll need to go to unrealengine.com and click on download up here in the top right. And you'll also need to create an Epic Games account to be able to use the engine, so be sure to do that too. Once you've downloaded the Epic Games launcher, you'll need to install the engine itself. So you'll need to go over here to your library tab, and you can see I already have a few versions of the engine installed, a whole bunch of projects, and a ton of assets in my vault. So what you'll need to do is click on Engine Versions, this little plus sign, and install whichever version of the engine you want. Okay, once you have the Epic Games launcher installed, and you have some version of the engine installed, we can create our first project. So what you want to do is launch your engine, and right here is where we can launch any existing projects that we've already created, but if this is your first time, obviously you won't have anything here. So over here we have different categories of preset projects. So we have a bunch of different game templates, film and video if that's what you're interested in, architecture, automotive simulation, and so on. But let's go into games and use the third person template. And over here we can change a few different things about the project. First thing I want to do is name this. I think I'm going to make a spooky cemetery, so I'll name it Spooky Cemetery. Take note of where it's going to save your project. And then over here we can change a few presets about the project as well. So I currently have starter content unchecked, and starter content is just a few different assets that get you started if you don't already have assets. So things like some tables and chairs, some pre-made materials, and even a couple of effects like fire and some smoke and sparks. So if you want to see the starter content and mess around with it, we can turn this on. Just be aware that if you're not going to use it, you shouldn't turn it on because it'll take up more space on your system, and it's kind of unnecessary. But maybe I'll turn it on for this project so that we can use maybe their fire element. Okay, let's press create, and now we're inside of Unreal Engine for the first time. So first thing we want to learn how to do is move the camera around. There's a few different ways we can do this. Without pressing any keys, we can use the right mouse button to look around. We can use the left mouse button to move around, and the middle mouse button will sort of change the elevation and strafe left and right. If you know programs like Maya, then you can use the Alt hotkey to move the camera around as if you're in Maya. It's kind of the same controls. And then if you're not familiar with other 3D programs, but you are familiar with video games, you can actually use the WASD keys to move around as if you're in a video game. Just hold down the right mouse button to turn the camera, and then use W, A, S, and D to fly around. Q and E will go up and down. I usually use these hotkeys to move around in the program because it just feels natural, kind of like playing a video game. Sometimes though, when you're making small adjustments, the camera can be moving too quickly. So over here in the top right, we can change the camera speed. If you need to make small adjustments, you can turn the camera speed way down, and you can see I'm moving really slowly. Now, if you're doing a giant city scene or a huge environment, you can make the camera speed really fast, but obviously that's probably way too fast for this project. So let's turn this back down. One more really helpful way to move the camera around is if you click on an object and you want to move it, but you want the camera to move with it, you can hold down Shift while you drag these arrows, and the camera will move with the object, which is very nice. While we're talking about moving objects, the hotkeys for move, rotate, and scale are W for move, E for rotate, and R for scale. So basically the same controls as Maya. You can also see those buttons are right here if you forget the hotkeys. Another thing is we currently have snapping on, so this is snapping every 10 centimeters when you're moving. This is snapping every 10 degrees when rotating, and this is snapping every 25% when scaling. So you can see when I move the object, it kind of jumps 10 centimeters at a time, and you can turn that off by clicking these buttons if you want to. I recommend actually leaving them on though, because it really helps when you're making a modular scene. A lot of people create environmental pieces, and they're designed to snap to the centimeter grid. So if I want to duplicate this thing, I hold down Alt and I move it, and you can see it drags out a duplicate, and it's designed to snap perfectly with the one next to it, if snapping is turned on. So most people, when they're making things for Unreal Engine, they create them to be modular and snappable. All right, continuing our tour of the interface, we can see the outliner over here. This is a list of everything in the scene. So below that, we can see the details panel. When I click on an object, we can see if something has more than one component or more than one part to it. Its subcomponents will be listed here. And below that, we have all the details. So this is the location, the rotation, the scale. We can see which mesh it's loading in, which model it's loading in for this object, and which material is applied. So we could actually change the model that's loaded in here if we wanted to. So let's say we wanted something right here on this point of the grid, but we want to change the model. We can use this rock, for example, just whatever's next in the list. And then we can also change the material of it. So right now it's using the prototype grid material, which is just this grid that we see everywhere. That's why the rock looks like this. But I'll bet you if we click on this and search for a rock, there'll be a rock material, which we can apply. So that's pretty cool. We'll press delete. Now we did create a third-person game template, so this game is already playable. If you press this play button in the top, you can see it loads in a character, and if you click in a scene, now we're playing the game. So I can move the camera around with my mouse, and I can use the WASD keys, and we're playing a little video game, and it's a lot of fun. To get out of the game, press escape. Now if we want to add something new to the scene, we can click on this little box with a plus sign, it's the add button, and you can see that there's a menu of lots of different things you could add. We have basic shapes, we have lights, we have cameras, but if you don't know where to find what you're looking for, you can just start typing. I'm going to type cube, and you can see I can just drop a basic cube into the scene if I want to. And one last thing I want to show you before we start customizing this level and importing our own models is how to change the lighting. So to change the lighting, you hold down Control and L, and holding down those keys will bring up this little dome, and just moving your mouse will change the lighting. It doesn't really have a nighttime mode, so if you go below the horizon, it just goes completely black, but we can make it look pretty cool like sunset. Okay, so how do we import custom assets and models and things like that into our project so we can have more than just this basic gray map? Well, there's a bunch of different ways to do it, and I'll show you a few of them. I'm gonna start by showing you just how to import something if you bought it and downloaded it from the Unreal Marketplace. If you tab back over to the Epic Games Launcher, you can click on the Marketplace tab, and there are a ton of assets here. A couple places to look if you just want to browse is go up to the free section and go to the Epic Games Content section, and they have a ton of free assets made by Epic Games that you can use. They have everything from locomotion systems, some really advanced muscle simulations, and giant levels like this jungle here, all the way down to just little decoration packs if you want them for your level. I also recommend checking out the free for the month tab. Every month user projects go up here for free, and also check out the new releases tab. There's also some ProductionCrate models up here, so if you search for modular castles, this familiar project will pop up. If you're a free ProductionCrate user and you want these projects, you can get them here on the Unreal Marketplace, but if you're already a pro ProductionCrate user, you don't need to get them here because they're also available on ProductionCrate for pro users. You don't have to pay extra. Once you've downloaded something from the marketplace, it should appear down here in your vault, in your library tab. So here's our ProductionCrate sci-fi armor. I'm going to click on add to project, and I'm going to click on show all projects, and I'll scroll down and find our spooky cemetery. Now I created the spooky cemetery in version 5.4. The latest version of this sci-fi armor was made in 5.3, but that's fine. As long as you're going to a newer version, you can click this and add it to the project. So I'm going to click on add to project, and we can see it's copying the file to our project. If I tab back over to our spooky cemetery, we can try to find that sci-fi armor and see where it is. So to bring up the file browser, which is called the content browser, you want to press Control and space. Now when you click out of the window will hide. So if you want it to stay open, hit Control space and click Dock and Layout. And now it will stay at the bottom of the screen. We can see here the content folder is everything that's in your project. There's a bunch of pre-made things, like the starter content that we added, but now you can see we have the PCrate Sci-Fi Soldier. Inside there we can find the meshes, which is our character itself, and if you want you could grab the skeletal mesh and drag and drop this into the scene. Now when I press play, I'm not controlling that character. If you want to see how to set up this character in Unreal Engine so that you're playing a custom character, we have a video for that. Check the link in the description if that's what you want to learn how to do. Now what happens if we want to add a custom asset that isn't already set up for Unreal Engine? We have a ton of them up on RenderCrate, so feel free to download any one you want as a test. I'm going to try out this free windmill. Now be aware, if you're making games, you don't want to necessarily get the most high-res version. So 4K might be too much for this depending on the type of game you're trying to make and what system it's for. But if we're trying to make a cinematic or a short film, then you want to get the highest quality one you can. So I'm just going to download this 4K version of the old windmill. Once it's finished downloading, we want to unzip it. And here are all the files that we're going to need to import it into Unreal Engine. Now we want to be really organized, so before I import it into the engine, I'm going to go into my content folder, and I'm going to be importing a lot of ProductionCrate models for this video, so I'm going to make myself a folder by right-clicking and creating a folder called PCrate. Inside of that, I'll create another folder called Windmill, and I'm going to drag and drop this FBX right here into the folder in my content browser. This window pops up, and I'm going to go to Mesh, Advanced. I'm going to click on Combine Meshes because some models are made of multiple parts and we don't want it to come in as a bunch of little pieces. We want it to come in as one model in this case. Now, our models are made to work fairly well in Unreal Engine, even if they're not set up to be native in Unreal Engine, but not every model is set up that way. So sometimes when you import things, they're really messy and disorganized. So I'm going to show you the way to import a model as clean as possible and set up the materials and the textures yourself. So I don't want to import my textures, but you can see I'm not able to uncheck that box. So I'm going to go here to where it says Create New Materials, and I'll say Do Not Create Material. Now I can uncheck the Import Textures box and go back to Create New Materials. And then I'll press Import All. And in this case, we got one model and one material. Some models will be more complicated and come with multiple materials. And like I said, if we hadn't unchecked that Import Textures checkbox, it might have imported a bunch of textures and plugged them in wrong. So that's why I like to import my textures myself, just to keep things nice and organized exactly how I want them. Let's do a little bit more organization here. I'm going to create a new folder called Meshes, and another one called Materials, and a third one called Textures. Let's move the model into the Meshes folder and click on Move Here. And let's grab the material and drag that into the Materials folder and say Move Here. Now we need our textures. So let's go into our Textures folder. And over here, I'm going to grab all of these textures. And we can see that there are actually a bunch of textures in here. The reason why there are so many is because there are different versions of this windmill. This windmill comes with a clean version, an old version, and so on. So in this video, I'm just going to focus on one version. I'm going to click on every one that says Old Windmill New. And you can choose whichever ones you want, but I'm going to click on Old Windmill New Base Color, Old Windmill New Metallic, Old Windmill New Mixed AO. Here's the normal map and the roughness map. So this is going to be a new looking windmill. And you could import all of them if you want to, but let's just keep it simple. Let's move these into the Textures folder. Okay, when you're importing custom assets into Unreal Engine that aren't set up for Unreal Engine by default, there's a couple settings you want to change on your textures to get them to work perfectly in Unreal Engine. So the first thing we want to do is find the metallic map and the roughness map and select both of those. And let's right click and go to Asset Actions, Edit Selection in Property Matrix. Sounds really scary, but this is basically just a spreadsheet where we can change settings on multiple objects at once. In this case, we have our two textures here, and we just want to uncheck this sRGB checkbox for both textures. These are not color maps, and so we don't want them to be color corrected or they'll appear wrong on the model. And let's hit Control S to save. We can close that. I want to change one more thing. In this case, you can see we've labeled our normal map as OpenGL. That's because this was made to work in Blender by default, but Unreal Engine is looking for a different type of normal map, so we need to change one setting. I'm going to double click on it, and I want to look for the checkbox that says Flip Green. If you can't find it, you can actually just click in a search bar and search for Flip Green Channel and turn on that checkbox, and then save and close. Again, we only had to do that because this is an OpenGL normal map. If you have a normal map that's DirectX format, you don't have to do that. Okay, let's go to the Meshes folder inside of our Windmill folder and drag the windmill into the scene. And then let's go over to the Materials folder and double click on the windmill material. If you've put together materials in other programs like Blender, this will seem fairly familiar to you. It's a node-based material editor. You can see right now it has a default white color plugged into base color. We can trash that. Let's hit Control Space to bring up our content browser. We'll navigate to our pcreate folder, into the windmill, and then into textures. And let's drag all of these into the graph. Now we just need to plug these into our material. We can spread these out so we can see them. And if you click on them, you can see the name of the texture right here. This is the base color. So I'm going to grab the RGB and plug that into base color right here. This one is the metallic map. So I'm going to grab the RGB and plug it into metallic. This one here says Mixed AO, which is short for ambient occlusion. So we'll plug that into the ambient occlusion. This one here is the normal map. So I'll plug this into normal. And this last one is roughness. So we'll plug that into roughness. Let's press apply and save. Now if we go back into the scene, we can see that our model is textured and it looks pretty new and shiny because we chose the new texture set. If we press play, we can run around and we've got this nice shiny windmill. One last thing to take note of is something called collision. So notice that my character is actually running into the model. She can't walk through it, but there's a really weird little bump where she can't walk right here. The collision layer is an invisible piece of geometry that your characters will actually run into. They don't run into the real piece of geometry. There's like an auto-generated invisible polygon that you can't walk through. And you can see it's not very accurate because there's this little triangle area that I seem to be unable to walk through. And I think that's probably because of this little fin hanging out way up here at the top. It's kind of stretching all the way down. So let me show you how to edit the collision layer. Let's go back into the meshes folder, and I'm going to double click on the windmill static mesh. Here's our model. If we go to show simple collision, it will show you the auto-generated collision layer. So if we're playing like a first-person shooter, our characters would not be able to walk through here, and we also wouldn't be able to shoot through here. So that would be really annoying for our players, right? So what you want to do is go up to Window and turn on Convex Decomposition, and this tab here should open up, and this is where you can change the auto-generated collision layer. If you just press apply without changing any settings, it will kind of recalculate it, and it's usually a lot more accurate if you just press that button. Now, if you need custom collision that you want to make yourself, that goes beyond the scope of this video, but we did cover that in a previous video right here, and we'll post the link in the description. Don't forget to press save, and we can close our window, and we can press play to test it out. Now our character can walk right up to the edge of the windmill, and it feels a lot more accurate. Okay, and I'm going to show you one more way to import custom assets into Unreal Engine, and then we'll finally be able to get started on our spooky cemetery. Go up to Window, and go to Quixel Bridge. Quixel Bridge will link you to the Quixel Megascans library, which are a bunch of free assets which are all 3D scanned from real-world objects. Now these assets are free to use inside of Unreal Engine. If you want to use them outside of Unreal Engine, like in Blender or anything like that, you have to pay for them, but as long as you keep them in Unreal Engine, they're completely free to use. First thing you need to do is go up here and log in if you're not already. You log in with the same account that you made when you downloaded the Unreal Engine software. So you don't have to make a new account, just log in with the same credentials. And now we can actually just start searching for assets and importing them into our scene. So I need a ground material. For that, I'm going to go to Surfaces, and I'm going to click on the ground category, and we can see a ton of 3D scanned real-world ground materials. I want kind of a dirt material, and then maybe a grassy or a leafy material, because I want to make a rundown looking spooky cemetery. So here's one called Nordic Forest Ground Moss. We can see that this material does tile in both directions, X and Y. And this is very important. Right here we can see that this represents a 2 by 2 meter square of forest floor so that we can get the scale right if we need to. Down here I'm going to choose high quality and click on download. We can see it starts the download. Now when this is done, it's not going to automatically add it to our project. It's just downloaded to our computer in sort of a shared library for every project we make in the future. If we want to add it to this project, I'm going to click add, and it should already be done. Let's look at our content browser, and we can see a new Megascans folder with a subfolder called Surfaces, and here's our mossy ground material. There's our 3 texture maps and the material itself. Let's grab a couple more. I'm going to grab one that's just dirt. I'll click on download and add it to our project. They also have 3D models. I don't know if we're going to need very many of them for this project, but let me show you how to download one really quick. Let's go to the building category, maybe to the pillar category, and we have some pretty cool looking pillars that could actually work in our cemetery project. I'm going to click on this modular gate pillar. I'll click on download right here, press add, and maybe I'll download one more, maybe this spooky looking statue, and I'll press add. Okay, I think that's enough Megascans for now. Let's add them to our scene. So the first thing I want to do is change my ground to a natural looking ground. Let's start with the dirt one. I'll go to my detailed fine dirt texture, and we'll drag and drop this onto the floor. We can see this looks cool, but it's obviously way too big. So what we can do is double click on the material, and these materials are actually set up in a really intelligent way that make them easily customizable. You may download materials from the Unreal Marketplace that are set up by users, and they may not have such intuitive controls, but these are made by Epic Games and they're really easy to adjust. So if we go into the global settings right here, I can turn on tiling, and I'm going to open that up, and now we can change the tiling in the X and Y direction and also the offset, and if we want to, we can change the rotation angle as well. So I'm going to go to tiling X, and you can see it's making the material tile in one direction. And then I can go to tiling Y and set it to roughly the same number. Now you definitely want to press play to test this out. And I can see the scale is still way off. So let's go really high, like maybe 30 by 30. And we'll press play. And we can see that actually looks pretty good. That looks like the ground. I'm also going to drag and drop the mossy ground material onto the floor here, just to get the scale correct. I may not use this material, but I just want it to be correct for when I do need it. So once again, let's open this up, turn on tiling X and Y, and I'll set this to about 30 by 30. Let's press play, and I can see that looks pretty good. That's about the right size. Really quickly, let's go back to our Megascans, 3D assets, and let's test out the 2 3D assets that we downloaded. So we've got our modular gate pillar. Interesting, that's not actually what I expected from the thumbnail, but that could still look pretty cool in our scene. Oh, I see, it actually comes in 3 pieces. That's pretty cool. That's actually really handy. Yeah, okay, that'll be really handy when we start building our scene, because we could maybe knock one of them over, because we're making kind of a rundown looking cemetery. So maybe we could do something like this. I like that a lot. Pretty useful. Okay, and let's try out that decoration. Maybe she could go over here on the wall. Looking good. Scale it up. Yeah, I think that's gonna look pretty awesome in our spooky cemetery. Now for all of the rest of the assets, I'm gonna jump over to RenderCrate, and I'm gonna go to the 3D category and the ancient subcategory. We actually have this gravestone pack, so I'm gonna download that. That should be perfect for our project. Scrolling down, I'm gonna grab this medieval stone construction. Notice that it comes in 8K though. We don't need that. That's a little bit too high res for Unreal Engine, so I'm gonna grab the 4K version. I also want this medieval stone stage. Maybe these medieval columns, those could come in handy. I want this throne. We need a door so we can get into the cemetery. And I'm gonna grab these walls, the small wall and the large wall, because I wanna make a small self-contained scene. I don't wanna worry about rendering things off in the distance. So we're gonna have a high stone wall cemetery just to keep it small and contained and sort of manageable. From there, feel free to grab whatever other decorations you want. So maybe some stone arches, some bricks if we want part of the wall to be collapsed. And I think I'm also gonna grab this stone path so we can have something interesting on the ground other than just dirt. Now, no spooky cemetery would be complete without dead trees. So I'm gonna go to 3D models, nature, vegetation right here. And I'm gonna download this grass pack. Again, 4K version, not 8K. And then I'm also gonna grab every dead creepy tree that we have. So this one, I really like this one a lot because it's like kind of long and reaching. We got this one here. Oh, we actually have a lot of dead trees. I didn't realize we had this many. So maybe 3 or 4 is enough. I don't think I need all of them. And now I just need to import all of those assets into my scene. Now I downloaded a lot of stuff, so I'm not gonna make you watch me do all of them. I'll just do 1 or 2 of them because some of them are really old and they were made before we were even thinking about Unreal Engine. So I just wanna show you how to handle things that weren't set up with Unreal Engine in mind. I'm gonna go back to my ProductionCrate folder and let's make a subfolder for large wall. And now I'm gonna navigate to where I downloaded all of my things and I wanna find the large wall. And we can see that this is actually not an FBX, it's an OBJ. So this is gonna import slightly differently because again, this is a really old model on our website and we made this before we were thinking about Unreal Engine, but don't worry, it'll still look really good. So I'm gonna drag and drop the OBJ into here and press import. We can see it creates the model and the material. Now let's go into the maps folder and I'm gonna grab just the diffuse, which is the color map. Now if we go into this material that was created when we imported the wall, we can see that Unreal Engine tries to convert OBJ materials into an Unreal Engine friendly material, and it creates all this stuff. We actually don't need any of this stuff. So highlight everything except the main material node on the right and just delete it. And it also makes the material transparent by default, which we don't want. So let's click on big wall, and where it says blend mode translucent, let's switch this back to opaque. And now we can drop our diffuse into the node graph and plug in the color. Okay. Let's put our model into the scene, and oh, don't forget to press apply on the material to update it. Now this model again was not made for Unreal Engine, so it's kind of sideways, but I really wanted to show you guys how to deal with importing models into Unreal that were not designed with Unreal in mind. They can still work. We can see that this actually looks really good, except that the model looks really smooth and shiny. So what we want to do is go over here into the material where it says roughness 0.5. That's too shiny for stone. Let's change that to something like 0.75 and press apply. That looks pretty good. You can make it even more rough if you wanted to. So if you download any of our newer materials, they should all be set up like this windmill with all the proper maps that are really easy to plug in. But if you download any of our older models from earlier on in our website, like this brick wall, they may look a little crazy when you first import them, but they can still be used in Unreal Engine very easily by doing what I just showed you. So now go through and just import all of the assets that you downloaded from the store, and we can start building our scene. All right, so we've got all of our models imported now, and I just want to make some quick notes about a couple of the objects. So first of all, if you imported our grass model from RenderCrate, it's going to create collision by default, and you can see it makes the character walk on top of the grass, which we don't want. So if you don't want your characters to collide with the grass models, here's how you can deactivate that. Go to where you imported the grass, double click on one of the models, and search for the word collision, and where it says collision enabled, change it to no collision, and press save. And do that for each model. And the last quick note that I want to remind you guys of is these models that come from Megascans from the Quixel Bridge window, they have materials that are set up to be very customizable. So we can see that the color of these stones doesn't quite match the walls from RenderCrate. So if we go to the Megascans folder, into the 3D assets, and we find the folder where that pillar comes from, there's a material instance here that I can double click on, and we can make some adjustments. If I go into the albedo menu here, which is the color, I can turn on the albedo tint and controls, and I can adjust the brightness, contrast, and even tint it. So if these walls happen to be green and mossy, I could tint this one green. But in this case, I think I'm going to increase the contrast, lower the brightness, and maybe turn down the saturation a little bit because it's kind of tinted brown and our walls are kind of gray. So let's turn down the saturation, and now you can see this material matches the walls from RenderCrate a little bit better. So that's why I like combining Megascans objects with our objects from RenderCrate, because it's really easy to make them look like they fit together. And the quality matches as long as you match the color. Okay, at this point, I think we can finally start constructing our scene. So what I'm going to do is go in and just delete all of these objects that I was putting down for testing. I'm also going to delete the objects that were in the scene by default, like these big gray structures. And we can use this as a template for our cemetery. Okay, let's start by constructing the walls. So I'm going to grab these 3 pillar pieces from Megascans, drag them into the scene, and we can see that they come in kind of stacked. So I'll just move them. And I really like this because we can use this to create modular pieces. If we need it to be taller, we just hold down Alt and duplicate this piece and move it up, and then we'll put that back together. Now if this looks too repetitive, we can also rotate this maybe 90 degrees so we see a different side. And now we've got a nice stone pillar. Okay, and I think we also need a wall. So I'll go into my PCrate folder, I'll find large wall, and we'll drag this out into the scene. This is one of those objects that was not made for Unreal Engine, so I need to rotate it up like this, and we can also scale it to something like that. I also downloaded something called Stone Segment. This is kind of like a topper for the wall, so let's put that up there too. And hopefully you can see what I'm doing here. I'm just trying to create kind of a section that I can repeat. I'm thinking it might look cool if this is rotated about 45 degrees, just for some extra dimension and volume. Make some interesting shapes with that wall. Now I'll duplicate this and maybe flip it so it's not repeating exactly the same. And maybe I'll make it 3 sections wide, like that. Now don't be afraid to think outside the box and use things for uses for which they weren't intended. So for example, if I want to make this look like a more sturdy castle wall, I can go into my small wall folder, drag this out, and maybe lean it and just sort of clip this into my big wall. Try to make like a reinforced looking structure like this. So once again, don't be afraid to think outside the box and kit bash things together in unexpected ways. Okay, so if I want to organize these a little bit better, I can select all the objects associated with my wall and click on this button that says create a folder containing the current selection. I'll call this wall section. And now I can hide that if I need to, or if I want to select everything in that group all at once, I can say select all descendants. I can make a really quick selection that way. I can also duplicate the wall now if I hold down Alt, and I can repeat this as many times as I need. So let's replace this existing wall. I'm going to hold down Shift and I can move my camera with this piece. And now I can hold down Alt and repeat this over and over. And I think I'll just duplicate this pillar here to cap off this corner. Very cool. I can delete this back wall and maybe I'll actually center this a little bit better. So I selected everything in that folder again, and now we'll duplicate it for this side. Let's duplicate it again and then rotate this. And I'll line this up. And I can see I actually have a duplicate pillar over here on the left side, so maybe I didn't actually need to copy that. So I'll just delete the duplicate that's kind of inside, kind of overlapping. Get rid of that back wall there. Now, as you're arranging things, you might notice that it's kind of hard to manipulate things. Sometimes it's hard to see what you're doing. So let me show you a couple tips to help you see better what's going on. First of all, if you go to right here where it says lit, we can change this to unlit. And now we see the scene with no lighting, just color. Sometimes it helps you see a little bit better because things are in shadow and it's hard to see actually what's going on. And Unreal has a bunch of other view modes you can try out. So there's a wireframe mode. You can do detail lighting, which is lighting with no texture. Sometimes this is helpful. And I also want to show you that there are other cameras. So right now we're in perspective mode, but if I go here to the top view, this can also really help you line things up. So we can see here's the main wall piece and it's roughly centered with this corner piece now. When you're done, you can just go back to perspective mode and go back to lit. All right, almost done. I just need to select that wall and duplicate it for over here and move it where it needs to go. I'll just check that both sides line up okay. Thinking it might look better if these corner pieces are rotated 45 degrees so that the corner points inward like that. Kind of looks like we could have a jousting tournament in here too. That would be pretty cool. So before I move on, it might be a good idea to sort of mess up this wall so it's not so perfect and uniform. This is supposed to look ancient and run down. So maybe what we can do is click on some of these pieces and go turn off your rotation snapping here and just slightly rotate things so they're not quite perfectly square. Make them look a little bit less than ideal. Just move them around. So it looks like over time things have shifted. And maybe even some of these pieces could be knocked on the ground. Okay, we need a way to get into our cemetery. So my next step is I'm going to put a gate right here on this end in the middle. So we can probably get rid of this pillar and the middle wall section. Let's go find that door that I downloaded from RenderCrate. And this is one of those ones that's not scaled for Unreal Engine, but that's okay. We'll scale this up. And I'm going to press play so I can check the scale and see how it feels. I actually think that looks pretty good. The door handles are about the right height and size for a person. I mean, it's huge, but I want it to feel like a massive castle door. Okay, and I believe I downloaded an archway from RenderCrate, so let's check that out. Yeah, right here. Maybe this could frame our door. So I'm going to close off this area. And you remember when I said don't be afraid to think outside the box? Another aspect of that is don't be afraid to scale things non-uniformly. I can see that this is the right size that I want here, but it's a little bit too thick, so I can scale it and squish it a little bit this way. I think I'm pretty happy with that. That looks like a big imposing medieval door. On this side, I'm going to put our throne. So let's sort of construct a similar structure using the stone construction that I downloaded from RenderCrate. Makes a great centerpiece and focal point for our scene. I always like to create the focal point early on in the process so that it feels like the scene has a purpose and a reason for existing. It kind of motivates everything else in my mind. Now that's quite an imposing focal point. We'll see if I end up keeping it that big. I'm not sure, but it does look pretty cool. Okay, I also downloaded a stage or a platform which we can place here. I know it's kind of weird to have a stage in a cemetery, but I'm thinking of making this kind of a spooky wizard or a necromancer lair. I'm trying to think of the scene that I want to create with this cemetery in the future. And of course, spooky wizards need a nice throne to sit and ponder their orbs. So I'll grab the throne, which I mentioned comes into Unreal a little bit too big, and we can place that either in front of this little cubby or maybe even push it back like so. Just like before, I'm going to press play so I can check the scale, and it feels like it's about the right height. I feel like the seat should be about as high as the back of a character's knees. Now, we've been doing a lot of work, so it's very important that we save periodically. One thing about Unreal Engine though, if you hit Control S to save, it really just saves the object that you have selected. If you want to save everything, absolutely everything in your project, you hit Control Shift S, or go up to File, Save All. Okay, I think the next step is I want to create sort of a path that runs from this door over to the throne. So I downloaded this stone floor asset from RenderCrate, and I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees like this because this is designed to be modular and tiling. So if I hold down Alt to duplicate it, I can see that it actually fits together like this. But before I start repeating it, I'm going to put it near the door and just get the scale of it right and get it lined up. Okay, now I can hold down Alt and repeat it, and I can actually do that multiple pieces at a time to make it go quicker. Pretty nice. Now this is a cemetery, and cemeteries usually have multiple paths, so maybe I can duplicate this one, rotate it 90 degrees, and divide the space this way as well. Okay, and here's another neat trick. Once we have our path laid out, it looks a little bit too perfect. This is supposed to look like an ancient and overgrown cemetery. So just like we did with the walls, we can kind of mess this up by pushing these down slightly into the ground, and it makes it look like they're overgrown with moss. We could also turn off rotation snapping and rotate them so there's more debris on one side of the square than the other. So we generally just want to mess this up and make it look less perfect. It also helps if you rotate them around the other way, so it's not exactly the same repeating pattern every time. Just gives it some more variety. All right, and there we go. We've got a broken path. All right, I think this is starting to look pretty cool, but we're making a spooky cemetery, and I don't see any gravestones. So let's drop in some gravestones. I'm gonna go to my gravestones folder, into meshes. Here are my 9 gravestones. I'm gonna drag these into the scene. Let's just scale these up, press play, and I think that looks pretty cool. Some of them are small. We got some tall ones. Let's start laying these out. So before I start arranging these, I'm gonna select all of my gravestones and put them into a folder, which I'll name Gravestones. And let's just lay these out side by side and have a look at them. Got a little tiny one right there. That's pretty cool. Okay, and I'm going to select everything in the folder, and let's start putting these in place. So I'm just gonna make a grid of them, and then I can start arranging them to hide the repetitive pattern. Okay, and I think what I'm gonna do now is maybe get rid of some of these small ones. I feel like those should be pretty sparse. And I'll just sort of swap some of these positions in each row so we don't end up with the same thing over and over. Another thing you can do is take some of these more generic looking ones and just flip them around. because they look different on the other side. And then the other thing is these really tall ones are very recognizable, so I would use them sparingly, because you can see how it's really recognizable that they're just these white columns everywhere and these big crosses everywhere. So try to use them a little bit more sparingly, I think. This stone here has a cross engraved in it, but if I flip it, it looks like a different headstone. And for even more variety, you can also scale them slightly differently. So I want the graveyard to be mostly the generic looking gravestones, with just some of the more unique ones used as accent pieces. When I get to an area like this where this piece fell off the wall, maybe it took out this gravestone so we can lay it down and make it seem like it's been damaged. This tall cross is also double-sided. If you flip it around, there's a different design on the other side, which can help with variety. And then this one here is very recognizable, but if you have two of them near each other, all you have to do is rotate it and it will look a little different. Maybe they're matching headstones for family members or something like that. So just take some time, go through, switch up the pattern, make sure you keep this path clear, and just try to add some randomness to it. And the last step will be to make these look a little bit less perfect, just like we did with the wall. So we can lean some of these, make them not quite square, not quite straight up, just to make it look like an old rundown cemetery that's not very well kept. Maybe some of the stones are even laying down on the ground. Okay, it's starting to look pretty spooky here. I think it's time to start adding some trees though. So I'm gonna grab one of these trees from ProductionCrate. This one looks a little small, so let's scale it up. And oh yeah, it looks pretty cool, huh? I think I want to have this one kind of growing out of a gravestone and knocking it over. I think I'll swap this one out like so. And I also think it'd be kind of cool if this big branch, this curly branch right here, was sort of wrapped around one of these taller ones. So maybe I'll move this over here. Yeah, I like that. And let's move this other tall one somewhere else. That looks pretty cool. I think this creates a nice little interesting vignette. I'm picturing when we get to lighting, maybe we can hang a lantern over here or maybe put some candles to really accentuate this sort of interesting layout. I think I'm going to use this tree one more time over here, and I'll change the scale and rotation of it because I don't want people to recognize that it's the same tree. But maybe we can use this to frame up our throne. And as long as you rotate it at least a little bit, the silhouettes look totally different. So you can reuse the same trees a few different times. Let's grab another tree, and maybe this one can be in the back corner. And then we've got one more tree. It's feeling pretty heavy on this side, so maybe I'll duplicate this one and put another tree over here. I think it looks really cool when it's hanging over and leaning. And we can also use the trees to hint at the world outside of our cemetery. So maybe I'll put some around the gate outside the walls to hint at a pathway leading to the cemetery. Just make sure to rotate them so they don't look too repetitive. While we're thinking about vegetation, let's take a look at some of the grass. So the grass pack that I downloaded from RenderCrate comes with a few different things. We've got individual grass blades, and then we have large patches. Now these are some more of those old assets that are not scaled for Unreal Engine, so I'm gonna have to scale them up. And I can use these big patches to really fill in a large area quickly. Now in the material for this grass, I didn't manually plug in any color because I wanted to try to match it to whatever color I picked for the ground. So you can see here in the material for the grass, I just chose a green color. If I had chosen a more brown, dead looking ground cover, I could change this to a brown, dead looking grass as easily as that. So for that reason, I chose not to plug in the color map and just choose a solid color manually. So I can take this grass model and I can duplicate it a few times, rotate it, scale it differently, even stretch it vertically if you want an area of tall grass, and that will really help to break up the ground and make it look more natural. One thing you want to try to do also is break up any sharp, straight lines. If you go out and look at the world, you can see that there are very few straight, unbroken lines in the real world, unless you're inside of a building. But out in nature, these lines where the walls meet the ground look way too straight to be natural. So we can actually line up some grass to break up these straight, unbroken lines and just make it feel a little bit more realistic. Okay, and the next thing I did was I downloaded more assets from ProductionCrate and from Megascans to spice up the scene. So I got these little doors and window openings to break up the monotony and hint at a larger world. And I used the Megascans materials to match the color to the ProductionCrate walls. And then I used the walls to create kind of like a little tunnel leading to a crypt. I'm planning to make this a nighttime scene, so I needed some light sources to make the environment pop and to draw attention to different points of interest. I also discovered these cool dirt mounds on Megascans, so I used them to show where the ground has been churned up and disturbed by roots and other things like that. And I also searched for any little props that I could find that would make this seem more like a necromancer's lair and not just a cemetery. So I'm talking things like torches, candles, bones, old books, and stuff like that. and I had fun staging them around the scene in interesting ways to try to tell a story. Alright, I'm done placing little props for now. I think I want to move on to lighting. But really quick, let me just show you what I set up. I just tried to create little vignettes for any players or viewers to find, like this creepy little cubby, this thing in the tree, and then of course, I wanted to create a focal point for the entire scene. In the future, if we do anything with this scene, I can imagine a character being here. But you'll notice that each of my little vignettes or focal points has a light source because this scene's going to be in a dark night environment, so I really want to draw people's attention to all these little areas. Now in your own scene, if you want to do daytime lighting or even sunset lighting, then you're already good to go. You can just set the sun where you want it to be, and it already looks great. But I want to do nighttime lighting. And for this, I'm going to adapt a tutorial from the YouTuber William Fauché because his nighttime tutorial is excellent. I recommend you guys check it out because he goes into a lot more detail and a lot more of the cinematic reasoning behind his choices. So I'm just going to adapt it for my own purposes for this scene really quick, and you can follow along here and then go check out his video for more ideas. So the first thing I want to do is search my scene for anything called light and delete it. I'm also going to search for the word atmosphere and delete my sky atmosphere. Notice that there are still clouds in the scene. These are the volumetric clouds. You can leave these in if you want to, but I'm actually going to delete them out of my scene. So now we started from scratch. Our scene is completely dark. If you need to, you can go to the unlit mode here to see what's going on, but I'm going to go back to lit mode. And now I need to create a nighttime sky. So I'm going to go over here to the content browser and click on the all folder and search for BP_sky. And I want to drop the BP sky sphere into the scene. Now really quick, you might be panicking because you don't see that. So if you don't see that when you search for it, come over here to the settings and turn on show engine content. So this is hidden content that the engine needs to run, which is normally hidden from the viewer. So I've dropped my BP sky sphere into the scene, and when I look up, I see the sky, but it looks like it's half blacked out. If I look over here, there's just this big black shape. So that means that I accidentally left some old sky assets in the scene. So I'm going to search for sky, and I can see right here, SM sky sphere. I need to delete that too. And now we have a brand new sunset looking sky. The reason why we're using this one and not the one that was already in the scene is because this one has a nighttime mode. To get the nighttime mode to work, I'm going to search for the word sun in the details panel and change the sun height all the way down to -1 to make it look like the dead of night. Of course, you can set it to whatever you want if you want sort of a sunset look, but I'm going to go all the way down. A couple other things you can change if you need to. Search for stars in the details panel, and you can increase or decrease the star brightness. It's up to you. And you can do the same thing with clouds. If you search for the word cloud, we can increase or decrease the cloud opacity, and we can even increase the speed so that it moves quicker. And if you want a really stylized scene, you can change the color of the clouds as well. So we have our sky, but we don't have a light source. So over here, I'm going to click on the add button and go down to lights, directional light. And this is currently looking way too bright, kind of crazy, looks like sunlight. So in the details panel over here, I can lower the intensity. Maybe I'll cut it in half for now. A couple other things you can change about this light. If you increase the source angle, it will soften the shadows. You can see the shadows here of the branches on the ground. You could choose a stylized color if you want a really crazy looking scene, but I'm going to hit cancel. And the other option for changing the color is to turn on use temperature. And then you can slide this temperature slider up or down to get warm light or cool light. I'm going to drag it all the way to the right and get nice, cool lighting. The next thing I want to do is search my outliner for fog and find exponential height fog. If that's not in your scene, it's possible that you deleted it when you were deleting the sky stuff. So you can just add a new one here with the add button. Just click add and search for exponential height fog and add a new one to the scene. In the details panel for the exponential height fog, I'm going to search for volumetric fog and turn that on. And you can see we get this nice blue haze, and it's dynamic and volumetric, meaning the farther away from the camera it is, the more intense the haze effect. Now really quick, we want to make sure that a setting is turned on. If you're using the latest version of Unreal Engine, it's probably turned on already, but let's just double check. I'm going to come up here to settings, project settings, and I'll search for the word fog, and just make sure that support sky atmosphere affecting height fog is turned on. Let's refine the look of this fog now. So if you click on the directional light and search for volumetric scattering intensity in the details panel, you can crank this up to maybe 3 or 4, and this already looks pretty cool. I want to get some of those God rays though, where you see the shadows of the trees passing through the fog. So once again, in my directional light under the details panel, I'm going to search for cast ray trace shadows. And in my project, ray tracing is turned on. In your project, it might not be turned on. So you might already see the God rays that I'm talking about. But the God rays, don't work with ray tracing. So where it says cast ray trace shadows, I'm going to go to disabled. Again, if your project doesn't have ray tracing turned on, then yours will already look the way that I want mine to look right now. You can see we get these light beams going in between the branches. That's what I'm looking for. To further refine the look of this fog, I'm going to select my exponential height fog once again, and I'm going to search for scattering distribution. And the way this slider works, if you slowly turn it down to 0, the fog will spread out and evenly distribute until you don't see any fog at all. Because at 0, it scatters kind of in every direction. But if you turn it up, then it scatters only in the direction that the light is facing. That means when it's pointing right at the camera, you're seeing a lot of scattering, and it kind of looks like there's a moon in the sky. But if I point it perpendicular to the camera, 90 degrees from the camera, we'll barely see any scattering at all. So we want to try to balance this. Depends on how you want to art direct your scene. This is totally up to you. But I'm going to go somewhere between the original setting and the highest setting. So it started at 0.2, so I'm going to go up to maybe about 0.4, 0.5, somewhere in there, so that we get this really intense glow when we look directly at the moon, but when we're looking 90 degrees, we still see some beams coming into the courtyard. Obviously, you can change this setting at any time if you need to. One last thing we want to do is sort of brighten up these shadows. They're way too pitch black. I want a little bit of bounce light in there, and there's two ways to do that. Under the directional light, in the details panels, you could search for indirect lighting intensity. And if you're using lumen, you can actually crank this up and there'll be more bounce light around the scene. Now, if you go too high, this can actually cause some issues. It could slow down your rendering. You could see some lighting artifacts and you'd have to do a little bit of work to fix it. So I'm actually going to turn this back down to the default. And let me show you the other way that you could do this. I'm going to go here to the add button and I'm going to create a skylight. And then I'll click on my skylight, go into the details panel, and where it says sky distance threshold, I'm going to set this all the way down to 1. And we can already see that it's lighting up the darkest shadows as if there's bounce light in the scene. So this is kind of a cheaper way to fake bounce light. And it looks pretty good. So either of those methods will work depending on the look you're trying to get, the version of Unreal Engine that you're using, and your project settings. Now I'm going to start placing all those warm candle lights around the scene to try to make this scene look a little bit more interesting. So I'm going to start over here. I'll go to Add, Lights, Point Light, and we'll bring this out, place it near this cubby. So here's how point lights work. First of all, we could pick whatever color we want, but just like with the moonlight, I'm going to use color temperature, and I'm going to turn this down to get a warm light. Maybe not all the way down, that's a little bit too crazy. Just kind of a warm candle light. We can also change the attenuation radius. So what that means is how far is the light going to reach into the scene. We can also change the source radius, and what that slider means is how big is the actual light source. When it's set to 0, it's like a pinprick. But if I turn the source radius up, it's like a bigger and bigger light bulb, and we get softer shadows. Now we have to be careful though, because we can see if the light is big enough that it extends under something, you're not going to get any shadows under there. So I want to lower my source radius to about the size of a candle flame, because that's what I'm trying to create. So let's make it really small, and I'll place this into the cubby. Now this is way too bright to be a candle light, so I'm going to change the intensity down to maybe 1, and I'm going to have 2 candles in here, so this might still be too bright. Let's go down to 0.5. Okay, looking good. Let's duplicate this for the other light on this side. So far, so good. Now, if we want these lights to produce a little bit of haze, we can search for volumetric scattering intensity and turn that up a little bit. Just to show you what it's doing, I'm going to turn it way up to something crazy like 100. And you can see it's actually casting a little bit of haze into the scene. But be careful with this, because as you can see, even if I go around here to block the light, we still see some haze. So it's not super realistic. We just want to use it to add a little bit of color to the scene. So maybe I'll set it to around 4. Okay, I'm going to duplicate this light and move it across to the other side, and I'll light up these candles. Now you don't need to make a light source for every single candle. You can see that I have a ton of them. I'm just going to create a light source for maybe each grouping of candles. Okay, let's duplicate this again, and I have another candle in this tree. So far so good. Let's keep going. And I do have another light source over here in this tree, appropriately spooky. And lastly, we need to work on this focal point. So I already have this light set up to be little candles. So first thing I'll do is set up the candles, and then I'll make these big torches. Got one little candle tucked behind the throne here, just to frame up those books, make them more visible. And now we can do those big torches. Now really quick, I set mine up to look like smoldering embers, but if you want an actual fire, because we added the starter content, there should be some fire particles in your content browser. So I'm going to search for the word fire. We can see that this comes with a nice little fire effect that you could use for yours if you want to. And it even casts a little bit of light in the scene, but I don't think it's enough to look like actual firelight, so you might still want to add a point light there. Now for these braziers, I'm going to turn my intensity way up to maybe 5 or even 8, and I'm going to increase my source radius to soften the shadows. And now we have a pretty good focal point for our scene. At this point, it's probably a good idea to save, so I'm going to hit Control-Shift-S to save my entire scene. Let's take one last look at the overall light. Very cool. I'm pretty happy with this. I think I'm going to fiddle with the lighting just a little bit more, and then it's going to be time to get to rendering. So before we start rendering, we want to set up some cameras, and we want to be able to animate those cameras. So we need to create a level sequence to put the cameras inside of. So let's do that first. So I'll navigate to my ProductionCrate folder. I'll make a new folder called Cinematics, and then inside the Cinematics folder, I'll right click, go to the Cinematics category, and create a new level sequence. Let's call this SQ for Sequence, Spooky, Cemetery. And if we double click to open that up, we can see that it's basically a timeline where we can place things and have them animate at render time. So let's create a new camera. I'm going to click on this little button right here, and this creates something called the Cine Camera Actor. It also creates a layer called Camera Cuts. So you can actually have multiple cameras and cut between them and have them all animating. But to keep it simple, we're just going to create one camera for now. Another thing to take note of is this blue button here with the picture of the camera. If that's activated in blue, it means we're actually inside of the cinematic camera and we're going to control that. If I click out of it, we're back in just kind of the camera that we use for editing, and the camera that we're going to use for rendering just stays behind, floating right there. So if we want to look through this camera, we have to click on this button right here. And pay attention to that button because it's easy to accidentally jump in and out of the camera mode. With the Cine Camera Actor selected, we can come over here and make some changes. So right now the film back is set to 16:9 digital film, and we can click on this to change the settings and simulate different sensors. So for example, if I go to 16:9 DSLR, we'll get a slightly different look. We can also change the lens settings. Right now it's set to universal zoom, so we can type in whatever settings we want, basically. But if you know that you want to emulate a certain type of lens, we can choose that from the list here. So for example, 50mm prime, f1.8, and now we get that look. I'm going to set it back to universal zoom. Down here we can see the current focal length is 50. We can type in 30 for a 35mm lens, but I'm going to keep mine at 50. You can also change the current aperture. So I'm not going to get too much into camera settings, but the aperture can affect things like how soft of a focus you get and how shallow of a depth of field you get. Speaking of focus, if we move up one right here where it says focus settings, we can open this up and we can turn on the draw debug focus plane. And then I'm going to click on where it says manual focus distance and just turn this down, and you'll see this purple square zooming towards the camera. That's showing you where the camera is focused in the scene. So I can push this back until it's focusing right on this sort of brazier and then turn off the debug focus plane. And now I can see that part of the scene is what's perfectly in focus, and everything else is going to be slightly out of focus, especially if it's really close to the camera like this grass down here. So that's how you can create a nice, really shallow depth of field look. Let's set up a little quick animation, and I'm thinking just a simple movement, like maybe we'll have the camera creeping through the grass like this and just kind of looking at the throne over there. So if we want to animate the camera, we'll come over here to the sequencer and make sure we're on our first frame of animation like that. And I'll click this little button right here to add a keyframe. And then I'll scrub all the way down to the end of the timeline, which is about frame 150 it looks like. And I'll move the camera a little bit, whatever motion you want. Then I'll go down to transform and add a new keyframe. And now when I press play down here, we get our motion. Couple quick notes about keyframes. If you want to keyframe the move, rotate, and scale separately, you can open up this transform menu, and you can see I can keyframe these all separately. Another thing you might have noticed, when I press play, you can see that it's easing in and easing out of the animation. If I want to change the animation curves to make it a linear movement or a constant movement, I can highlight these keyframes and right click and change it to linear. Same thing on the last keyframes here. And now there won't be easing in or easing out. It's just going to play at a constant speed. So let's go up to Window, Cinematics, and I'm looking for Movie Render Queue, but you can see I don't have it in my list. That means I don't have the plugin activated. So before we can open that up, let's go over to our Settings tab, to the Plugins menu, and I'll search for Movie Render Queue. Let's turn on Movie Render Queue and Movie Render Queue Additional Passes, and now it's going to ask us to restart. So just go ahead and press that and let the engine restart. Okay, once we're back in the editor, we can go back into the ProductionCrate folder, into the Cinematics subfolder, and find the sequence that we were working on and just double click that. And now we're back in our sequence. But take note that we're not back in our camera necessarily. So if you want to go back into a specific camera, you have to click on this button here and it will jump to that camera. Okay, let's go up to Window, Cinematics, and open up the movie render queue. And now we want to add a new render. We're going to select my sequence, the Spooky Cemetery, and you can see it's referencing the sequence that we created and the level that we created as well. Take note really quick, it's going to save into your project folder, into the saved subfolder, and then into the movie renders subfolder. So that's where you're going to find the frames that we're about to render. Let's click on the settings, unsaved config, and here's where we can change a few things about our project. So I don't want to do a JPEG sequence, I'm going to delete that, and instead I'm going to use PNG sequence. So I'm going to go to settings, PNG sequence. Okay. To get nice motion blur, I'm going to go to settings and add anti-aliasing here at the top. And I'm going to click on override anti-aliasing. And where it says temporal sample count, I'm going to type in 64. You could do a lower number like 32 if you want to, because this will take longer to render. And if your computer's kind of slow at rendering, you might want to use a lower number. But basically what it's going to do is instead of rendering every frame of the animation, it's going to render every frame and 64 subframes in between each frame. So you can see how that would really increase your render time. But the benefit of that is it can take all your subframes and sort of smear them together to create nice motion blur. Now that's going to cause a couple of weird artifacts if we don't change some things about the way the engine renders. So I'm also going to go up to settings and add console variables. And this is going to let us type in little snippets of code or script that will change the way the engine renders our scene. And just a quick note, I'm getting these settings from the official Unreal Engine documentation. If you want to look it up, the article is right here. But if you scroll down near the bottom of the page, these are the things I'm going to add to my console variables right here. So here's how we do that. Where it says console variables, I'm going to add a little plus. I'm going to copy and paste the first little line like that. And I'm going to make sure the value is set to 0. And then I'll add 3 more console variables for the other ones and do the exact same thing. So when we're done with all that, we can check the output settings and just take a look to make sure that the output resolution is what you want. If you want a different frame rate, you can change that here. I'm not going to mess with any of that. But once again, just double check where it's going to save to. Okay, I'll press accept. So I'll press render local. Okay, we can see that it's working. You can see it's cranking through the frames right now. We're on frame 5, 6, 7. It's going pretty quick. And right below that, we can see the subframe just flying by, 64 subframes per frame of animation. This is actually going pretty quick. It looks like it's going to take about 3 minutes to render. So I'm going to pause the video and come back when it's done, and we'll take a look at it in After Effects. And here it is, our finished shot inside of After Effects. From here, you can move on to color correction and adding effects. All right, and that's it. Hopefully through this video you've discovered that Unreal Engine is not as scary as it needs to be. It's a great tool to add to your VFX pipeline, and it doesn't take too long to get a really nice looking scene to add to your film projects. Obviously Unreal Engine is great for making games as well, so if you want to learn a few gameplay features, be sure to check our channel for more Unreal tutorials. I actually already did a video on how to set up a custom character and be able to control it in real time. And we did another video on how to add attack animations to your characters. And we also made a tutorial on interactive doors. If there's anything else you'd like to learn in Unreal Engine, whether it's for video games or for VFX and short films, be sure to leave a comment down below. And if you make anything cool with Unreal Engine, be sure to tag us on Instagram with it or post it to our Discord. All right, later creators.